They bulldozed my wife's memory at 6:17 on a Saturday morning. No meeting, no vote. Just a woman in capri pants waving a clipboard like it was a court order and a yellow bulldozer flattening a 130-year-old dock into lake debris. I didn't even have time to lace my shoes before I heard the crunch. The dock wasn't just wood. It was the last thing Maggie and I built together before that car ran a red light and took her from me. And there stood Deborah Langston, live streaming the whole demolition like she was proud of it. She called it an emergency community safety measure. I called it a declaration of war. You don't rip up a man's grief with heavy machinery and expect him to sit back down with his coffee. No, ma'am. That morning changed everything. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If you love wild, true-feeling stories packed with twists, justice, and just the right amount of HOA chaos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is even more jaw-dropping, and trust me, the surprises coming next, you won't want to miss them. My name is Ely Prescott. I live at 103 Shoreline Bend, in a cabin that hugs Willow Ridge Lake like it knows how to listen. After Maggie died, I came here to disappear, not to join some neighborhood soap opera. The dock out back, 30 feet of cedar, built in the 1890, wasn't just some leftover lumber. It was our sanctuary. We restored it by hand that final summer, sanded it, sealed it, and painted the rails a sky blue to match Maggie's favorite sundress. Every morning I'd carry out 2 mugs of coffee. Hers stayed full, but it made me feel like she was still sitting there with me. That dock was where we talked, laughed, grieved, and planned things we'd never get to finish. It wasn't just a structure. It was a promise I wasn't ready to let go of, and for 2.5 years, no one had a problem with it. Then Deborah moved in. She arrived like a new sheriff in town. White SUV, oversized sunglasses, and that haircut women get when they're about to ruin someone's weekend. She introduced herself as the new HOA president, even though nobody remembered electing her. Within days, she was measuring trash bins, snapping photos of lawn ornaments, and quoting bylaws like she wrote the Constitution. I figured she'd burn out after a few Facebook rants, but I underestimated how far a bored woman with a clipboard could go. Her first official act? Declaring my dock a violation of Aesthetic Code 8.4b, which, as it turns out, she had drafted herself just a week earlier. When I told her the dock predated the HOA, she smirked and said, "So did the telephone, but we still have iPhones." That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with a neighbor, I was dealing with a dictator in discount heels. She showed up with her cousin Barry, a plumber who apparently moonlighted as a structural engineer. He poked the dock a few times, nodded sagely like he was inspecting the Hoover Dam, then handed Deborah a report declaring the structure an imminent liability risk. She taped a printed notice to my gate, full of legal-sounding gibberish and a deadline for removal. I called my old college buddy Rick Calder, now a real estate attorney with a talent for swatting down HOA nonsense. Rick laughed so hard I thought he'd choke on his sandwich. "Ely, that dock is grandfathered in 6 ways to Sunday," he said. "She's bluffing. You're covered." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But something about Deborah's smile stuck with me. The kind that says, I already made the call, I'm just waiting for the crash. Sure enough, a few days later I woke up to the sound of steel tearing through my memories. She didn't go to court. She didn't appeal. She just acted. Because people like Deborah don't need permission when they think they are the authority. And as I stood there on my lawn, barefoot and speechless, I realized the bridge wasn't the only thing she'd demolished. She took the last physical piece of Maggie I had left and tossed it into the lake like yesterday's garbage. But what she didn't know, and what I was about to show her, is that I don't get even with fists. I get even with paperwork. And if she wanted a legal war, I had years of engineering plans, a good lawyer, and all the time in the world. Deborah Langston didn't just bulldoze my dock, she bulldozed logic, decency, and anything that stood between her and HOA domination. And she didn't bring facts, she brought Photoshop. Within days of the demolition, she launched an online campaign called the Community Safety Awareness Project, which was just her dressed up as Paul Revere, but instead of warning about the British, She was warning about my dead wife's dock that no longer existed. She posted blurry photos of collapsing bridges from news articles, one from Minnesota, another from Japan, and superimposed Willow Ridge in red block letters. I wish I were exaggerating. Every post was dripping with fear-mongering. "Could this happen on our lake?" she asked. Technically no, because what she was showing was a 4-lane highway span over a river, and what I had was a 30-foot bridge that barely held 2 people and a fishing pole. But Deborah was less concerned with truth and more obsessed with control, so she brought in her cousin Barry again. Yes, the same Barry who unclogged her kitchen sink in 2019 and has now apparently become a structural safety expert, because he once watched a documentary about earthquakes. Barry showed up with a tape measure, a level, and a high-visibility vest that still had a Halloween tag on it. He paced around neighbors' properties, scribbling nonsense in a spiral notebook and declaring things like unbalanced sight lines and liability protrusions. He told Old Man Jenkins his gutter was an unintentional horizontal hazard, which I'm pretty sure means absolutely nothing. But Deborah didn't care. She uploaded Barry's fake reports as gospel and started tagging neighbors in posts that read like veiled threats. "Concerned for your family's safety? Schedule your inspection today." It was ridiculous, but it worked. People were nervous. Because if someone's willing to tear down a memorial dock, what else are they willing to do? Then came the HOA meeting, the kind of spectacle you'd expect at a shareholder revolt or the second act of a courtroom drama. Deborah reserved the Willow Ridge Community Center and transformed it into her personal war room. She had a projector, handouts printed on glossy cardstock, and a slideshow with titles like Docks of Danger and When Neglect Becomes Liability. She walked the room through cherry-picked statistics about lawsuit settlements, showed more images of massive bridge collapses, and paused after each one for dramatic effect. People sat in silence, half of them sipping coffee, the other half looking like they'd just learned the lake was radioactive. When she clicked to a graph labeled, "Your home's value is at risk," I actually saw one neighbor clutch his chest. All this over a dock that no longer existed. But fear travels faster than fact, and Deborah knew how to package it. That's when Judge Hank DeWitt stood up from the back row, all 6'2" of him in a denim jacket and a stare that could shut up a chainsaw. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't insult, he just cleared his throat and said, "Deborah, I've lived here 38 years. That dock survived more storms than this room has birthdays, and if it had made it through your little demolition stunt, it would have survived another 40. He turned to the room. "We're not here to talk about safety. We're here to talk about whether we're okay with destroying history because someone doesn't like how it looks in their Instagram feed." That broke the tension like a twig. People chuckled. Deborah didn't. She clenched her clipboard like it was a crucifix and said nothing. Hank motioned for a vote. The result? 8-7 in my favor. The dock couldn't be rebuilt without a permit, but any further harassment was officially denied by the board. As the crowd shuffled out, Deborah stayed behind, arms folded, jaw tight. I gave her a nod, not because I liked her, but because I still believed in being civil. She walked right up to me and spoke so quietly only I could hear it. "This community deserves better leadership, Mr. Prescott. Sometimes you have to protect people from their own sentimentality." Then she smiled, not the warm kind, the kind you see right before a horror movie monster takes off the mask. And just like that, I knew I hadn't won. I'd delayed. Because Deborah wasn't wired to accept defeat. She was wired to escalate, and something in her tone told me the next move wouldn't involve a vote or a meeting. It would come fast, without warning, and leave another mark I couldn't fix with paint or patience. Stay tuned. What she did next made this look like amateur hour. If you thought a fake safety crusade and a cousin with a tape measure were bad, just wait until you hear what showed up in my yard at sunrise. Deborah wasn't finished, and her next move made bulldozing a memorial look like a warm-up. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens when a clipboard queen crosses the legal line one time too many. Trust me, the real chaos is only just beginning. I woke up to the sound of destruction. You know how you can tell when something's wrong before your feet even hit the floor? That was me at 6:17 a.m. I rolled out of bed thinking maybe the city was fixing a pothole until I heard the engine groaning, heavy and slow, like a beast that had no business being that close to my yard. I looked out the back window, and there it was, a bright yellow bulldozer squatting beside the dock like it owned the place. Barry was behind the wheel because who better to handle sensitive demolition than a part-time plumber with a YouTube degree in destruction? And right next to him, naturally, was Deborah Langston, live-streaming the entire circus with her phone in one hand and some kind of official-looking paper in the other. It felt less like mourning and more like a scene cut from a bad documentary called How Not to Be a Neighbor. I ran outside, shirt half-buttoned, voice cracking with disbelief. "What are you doing?" I yelled. Deborah didn't even flinch. She held up her permit like it was a holy document and shouted loud enough for her phone's mic to pick up, "This is an emergency demolition order authorized by the city. The structure has been deemed hazardous and must be removed immediately." She had that same smug tone she always used when she was stretching the truth to the point of snapping. I reminded her that the HOA had voted, that Judge Hank had spoken, that she didn't have the authority. She just smiled and said, "The vote was advisory. This is about public safety." And just like that, Barry pulled the lever, and the bulldozer rolled forward like a death sentence on wheels. I could barely move. I stood there like my shoes were bolted to the earth, forced to watch Maggie's memory splinter into lake water and mud. Watching that dock get destroyed felt like losing her all over again. Every crack of the boards was a conversation we'd had. Every piece that flew off into the lake was a morning coffee, a shared joke, a goodbye I hadn't gotten right the first time. It wasn't just demolition. It was a funeral reenacted by machinery. There's a kind of helplessness that comes when you see something sacred reduced to debris, and all you can do is stand there while someone records it for clout. And Deborah, she narrated it like she was hosting a home makeover show. "Here at Willow Ridge," she said to her live audience, "we take safety seriously. We care about protecting our residents from unapproved hazards." That's when I noticed Judge Hank, standing on his porch in a bathrobe, camera phone in hand, recording everything. Thank God for early risers with long memories and short patience for bullies. But nothing prepared me for what came next. As the final chunk of railing sank into the lake, Deborah turned to me and said, loud enough for the stream and the heavens to hear, "Your wife is gone, Eli, and that dock should be too." That sentence hit harder than the machine. I felt like someone had kicked me in the ribs and smiled while doing it. Judge Hank's head snapped up. You could see the shift in his face, like a man realizing he's not just watching injustice, he's witnessing something worth testifying about. Deborah was still smiling, oblivious to how deep she'd just cut, not just into me, but into her own credibility. It's one thing to lie with confidence, it's another to mock a man's grief with a front-facing camera and expect applause. And in that moment, she crossed a line I didn't even know I'd drawn. When it was over, they packed up like it was just another Saturday project. Barry drove off. Deborah ended her stream with a rehearsed nod, and I was left standing in the wreckage, holding pieces of Maggie's dock like a man sifting through memories at a junkyard. Hank walked over and handed me a thermos of coffee, still filming with his free hand. "She just hung herself," he said quietly. I got it all. I nodded. Not because it made it better, but because it meant the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because when someone bulldozes your grief and brags about it online, you don't just grieve, you plan. And that morning, standing ankle-deep in water and cedar splinters, I decided I wasn't going to fight her feelings with mine. I was going to fight her lies with law. Stick around. This battle was about to get personal, legal, and loud. When someone bulldozes your wife's memory, you either break or you calculate. I chose the latter. And, like any good engineer who's been wronged, I didn't reach for a hammer. I reached for the law. That same afternoon, over coffee and quiet rage, I called Rick Calder, my college roommate turned real estate attorney. I didn't even finish explaining before he interrupted with a chuckle that meant trouble. "Eli," he said, "you know what sits in front of her dock? State-owned underwater land." That sentence hit me like a blueprint for vengeance. And the best part? He added, the state sells that land. It's legal, it's simple, and it's wide open. For the first time since the doc died, I felt something other than grief. I felt leverage. Turns out, buying the bottom of a lake is easier than buying a couch from Wayfair. No 8-week shipping delays, no confusing instructions, just a form, a $50 fee, 0 cents per linear foot fee, and a permit review. Deborah's dock stretched 40 feet, you do the math. For $2,000, 0 cents, and a little paperwork, I could become the legal owner of the soggy patch directly under her oversized, unpermitted slice of lakefront smugness. Rick ran the numbers, checked the parcel maps, and confirmed what I was praying for. Nobody had ever bought the underwater land in front of her property. It was just sitting there, unguarded, unclaimed, waiting. Legally speaking, it was a blank check written to the first person who knew how to cash it. And I was ready to make that deposit. But before we pulled the trigger, Rick did a deeper dive. Because you don't go to war with just paperwork, you go with evidence. And what he found was better than a smoking gun. Deborah's dock wasn't just sitting on land she didn't own. It was built without a single permit, a single inspection, or a single ounce of legal logic. It extended past approved boundaries. It had electrical lighting that violated code, and it had been constructed during a time when Deborah had been preaching to neighbors about compliance and community responsibility. The hypocrisy was so thick you could insulate a house with it. Rick forwarded me the state's official inspection records. Not only had she skipped permits, she'd been warned once and ignored it. That was the legal equivalent of gift-wrapping her Achilles heel. The plan was simple. I'd apply to purchase the 40-foot strip of underwater land in front of her dock. Once approved, I'd own the soil her dock was rooted in. That meant I could build my own structure. A permitted, engineered, legally sound memorial dock. In the exact line of sight she paid $1 million to preserve. I wouldn't touch her property. I wouldn't violate a single rule. But every morning, Deborah looked out her window. She'd see the consequence of bulldozing what didn't belong to her. I wouldn't rebuild the past. I'd redefine the view. The beauty of it wasn't just the revenge. It was the elegance. Law, as Rick once told me, isn't a weapon. It's a scalpel. And I was about to make the most precise cut of my life. So we filed the paperwork on a quiet Wednesday morning. Rick submitted the purchase application, the engineering diagrams, the survey results, and the request for a new dock permit, every dotted line in perfect order, and then we waited. 60 days. That's the review period for a land purchase like this. Plenty of time for Deborah to notice something was off. And sure enough, 3 weeks in, she did. I was out in my yard with a surveyor when I caught her peeking through her curtains, phone pressed to her ear like she was calling the Pentagon. Chuck told me she stormed out later that day, waving a letter from the state and shouting at the air. That was the beginning of her unraveling, but we weren't done yet. Because owning mud is one thing, using it to turn the tables, that's where the real story starts. Stick around, it gets deeper, literally. If you think buying the mud under her dock was petty, wait until you see what I built on top of it. Deborah thought the law was her weapon. Turns out it was mine. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens when a quiet widower turns a legal loophole into $1 million view-blocking masterpiece. The real payback? It's just getting started. If owning the mud under Deborah's dock made her nervous, filing to build on it sent her into full-scale meltdown. She didn't knock, didn't call, just served me with a lawsuit so thick you could prop open a barn door with it. According to her high-prize attorney, my application to construct a memorial dock was grief-fueled harassment, emotional coercion, and, my personal favorite, topographical intimidation. You'd think I was building a fortress, not a 40-foot floating platform with a plaque. But the goal wasn't to win in court. It was to stall, scare, and smear. Deborah assumed that a man still mourning his wife wouldn't have the energy to fight back. She'd forgotten something critical. Grief may bend a man, but it doesn't break one who's finally found purpose. That's when Kendra Pierce entered the story like a well-timed plot twist. She was an investigative journalist who'd been quietly following the viral video of the bridge demolition, and as it turns out, she wasn't just watching. She was digging. What she uncovered was a goldmine of HOA corruption, past abuse, and permit fraud, with Debra's name stamped across every dirty page. Kendra found documentation from Debra's last community, where she'd been forcibly removed from the HOA board after racking up neighbor complaints, 2 restraining orders, and an illegal patio expansion that nearly burned down a gazebo. But the pièce de résistance? Emails between Debra and her contractor revealing that she knew her current dock violated state law. "No one checks permits out here," she'd written. "Just build it." Famous last words. When the hearing finally arrived, the courthouse was packed, like someone was giving away free cable. Neighbors, reporters, even a few out-of-town legal buffs showed up just to see what all the noise was about. Judge Marilyn Poe presided, sharp as a tack and allergic to nonsense. Debra's lawyer, slicker than a greased oath, stood up first and painted me as a man weaponizing sorrow in a strategic campaign of retaliation. He said my application was a psychological assault, a grief-driven act of vengeance with no merit beyond malice. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then, Rick Calder stood, calm and surgical, and laid it all out. The legal land purchase, the engineering documents, the proper permit filings, the inspection reports. By the time he finished, Debra's legal team looked like they'd just realized they'd brought a crayon to a chess match. But nothing could top what came next. Debra herself. She took the stand, all poise and pearls, and tried to play the victim. She claimed she was protecting the community from unauthorized emotional displays, said my dock would depress home values and create negative energy. But under cross-examination, Rick hit her with the emails, the texts, the permit violations, the contractor instructions. She stammered, she stalled, and then she cracked. "That's different," she shouted, voice climbing higher with each word. "I built it because I could, because I'm the HOA president." The courtroom gasped. One neighbor actually whispered, "Oh boy." Judge Poe raised an eyebrow, leaned forward, and said, "Ms. Langston, did you just admit to knowingly violating state construction codes while holding office in a homeowners association?" Debra's lawyer tried to object, but the damage was done. The woman who burned a bridge had just drowned in her own hypocrisy. Live and under oath. The ruling came swift and clear. My dock permit was approved without conditions. I was awarded $25,000, 0 cents in damages for the destruction of my bridge. Debra was fined, stripped of her HOA title, and ordered to bring her illegal dock into compliance within 30 days or face full removal. But that wasn't all. Judge Poe ordered a full investigation into every lakefront property in Willow Ridge for unpermitted structures. You could practically hear the HOA board's group chat implode. As I walked out of that courtroom, people clapped. Strangers patted my back. One guy handed me a muffin. And all I could think was, this wasn't just a win for me. It was a win for every quiet homeowner who ever got ambushed by a clipboard and a fake smile. But the real show? That was still ahead. Because while Debra lost in court, I was just getting started on something she couldn't sue her way out of. My new dock. Stick around, the final scenes got light, legacy, and just a little noise. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I've found it pairs better with cedar, solar lights, and a plaque that makes clipboard tyrants gag. 60 days after the hearing, my new dock was finished. 60 glorious feet of engineered perfection, stretching into the lake like a quiet rebellion. Built by licensed contractors, inspected twice, and approved on every level, it was wider, sturdier, and longer than Maggie's original dock. Not because I needed the space, but because symmetry has never been more satisfying than when it blocks someone's $1 million view. At the end of the dock, mounted on polished mahogany, sat a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Maggie Prescott, you can knock down wood but not love." Or, "Zoning permits." I cried the day it went up. Then I smiled, because healing can look a lot like strategy. The features were simple, but intentional. Solar-powered LED lights that ran all night long, visible from every angle of Deborah's house. Lakeside benches where I could sit with my coffee, nodding gently at her blinds. A weatherproof sound system that played Maggie's favorite jazz on Sundays, soft but just loud enough to drift over the water. And yes, all of it was legal, fully permitted, beautifully documented. The dock wasn't just a structure, it was a cathedral of calm built from memory and spite, and every morning Deborah opened her curtains, she had no choice but to see it. No more sunrise views. Just me, sipping coffee and waving like the mayor of poetic justice. Meanwhile, her world crumbled like a stack of expired HOA notices. The state hit her with $87,000, 0 cents in fines for her unpermitted dock, electrical violations and fraudulent filings. Her attorney ghosted her. The HOA board held an emergency vote and removed her from office by a landslide. She'd tried to sell her house twice, but between the fines, the reputation, and the fact that her dock now sat illegally on land she didn't own, buyers ran faster than a cat from a vacuum cleaner. For sale signs came and went, each one drooping a little more than the last. Rumor had it she dropped the price $60,000, 0 cents below market just to get someone to bite. Nobody did. Nobody wanted to inherit her war. Kendra Pierce's final article dropped the same week Construction wrapped, titled "The Dock That Sank a Dictator." It chronicled every step of the saga, from the bulldozed bridge to the courtroom bombshells to the final victory plank drilled into place. The piece went viral. National outlets picked it up, HOA reform forums exploded with support, and suddenly I was getting emails from people across the country sharing their own clipboard horror story. Folks were calling my dock a symbol of resistance. Kids biked over just to see the plaque. Someone left flowers. One guy mailed me a hand-carved fish with freedom floats etched on the side. For a man who only wanted to be left alone, I had somehow become a folk hero for neighborhood justice. But left in a rental truck 6 months later. No fanfare, no goodbye. Just her, Barry, and one last dirty look hurled across the water as I sat on the bench lifting my coffee in salute. She didn't wave back, but she didn't need to. The silence said it all. Sometimes you don't need to raise your voice, you just need to outlast the noise. And as she drove off down the street she once ruled with passive-aggressive post-its and HOA threats, I thought of Maggie. I thought of every morning we spent on that bridge. And I felt peace. Not because I'd won, but because I'd rebuilt what mattered. If you've ever been crushed by someone with a clipboard, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started. And that's how a quiet man with a memory, a blueprint, and a backbone turned a tragedy into a legacy. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break a law. I just stood my ground and let the truth do the heavy lifting. What started as one woman's mission to erase my past ended with an entire community waking up to what leadership really looks like and what it never should. I didn't just build a dock, I built a message. That grief isn't weakness, kindness isn't silence, and if you weaponize rules to hurt people, don't be surprised when those same rules come back to bury you. Neatly filed, properly signed, and right on schedule. This story isn't just about HOA drama or property lines. It's about how we handle loss, power, and the people who try to control what doesn't belong to them. It's a lesson in patience, in knowing when to let things go and when to fight like hell. It's about turning pain into purpose and making sure no one else gets steamrolled by a clipboard and a fake smile. And maybe, most of all, it's about Maggie. The kind of person who would have hated the conflict but loved the ending. Her name's on the plaque, but her spirit built every inch of that dock. And now, thanks to her, that lake isn't just peaceful again, it's protected. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever faced someone like Deborah, or watched someone you love be pushed aside like they didn't matter? Leave a comment below and tell us what you took from it. Hit the like button if you believe that justice doesn't have to be loud to be strong. And don't forget to subscribe, because next time we've got another true feeling story with more twists, more justice, and a whole lot of poetic payback. You don't want to miss it.